Well, let's get to it. World Studies. Hope y'all are well. And we are going to look at a very interesting section today. And it starts on page 353. 353. But want to go through a little bit of it. And again, this is all under the heading of the Cold War. But this gets into some specifics of the Cold War. So let's go through those. And first, your book talks about the differences between democracy and communism. And hopefully, to goodness, you know those by now as much as we've talked about it in class. If not, reread that. If you have any questions, message me. But you should know the difference between communism and democracy. So, we're going to move ahead. The first thing I want to talk about, Big League, is the fall of China to communism. Mao Zedong, he had the backing of the Soviets, and Chiang Kai-shek, he had aid from the United States. But what Zedong or Mao kept doing is he would promise a whole bunch of stuff to the Chinese people and say, hey, this is going to be great, this is going to be utopia, those type of things. And he got enough popular support to drive Chiang Kai-shek off to the island which is now known as Taiwan. It became the Republic of China. China to this day will not recognize the government of Taiwan. So there's still a hatred there between those two. Made in Taiwan used to be a big thing growing up. Taiwan is not as powerful, I don't think, as it was before. China has taken over a lot of that. But we're going to talk about Mao a little bit. They even had a short war with China, with Russia. China did. They initially, Mao and the Soviets were buddies, and then they started denouncing each other and criticizing each other. The Soviets did, and Mao Zedong did. And so they ended up having a little war between the Chinese. It was over a border dispute, the Chinese and Russia. And so Mao comes up in 1949 with a Soviet-style 5-year plan. It was basically an agricultural and industrial production plan. And within 5 years, we're going to accomplish these great goals. Well, that didn't work. It just didn't develop. So in 1958, he comes up with the Great Leap Forward. Great Leap Forward. And it wanted to double the production of steel and agricultural products. The problem was they didn't give them all the ingredients to safely make steel, and the agricultural products, it was a mess. And long story short, there was a big famine. And your book mentions 20 to 30, now picture this number, 20 to 30 million Chinese died as a result of the Great Leap Forward. 20 to 30 million people died. And that's not to count the fact that Mao had a cultural revolution. And the Cultural Revolution, he would get groups to go around and they would rough up people and they would kill people. Mao was a murderer. He was one of the most heinous murderers of all time. Plain and simple. One of the most evil people of all time. And none of the things he tried worked. I mean, everything was an abject failure. He died in 1976, which was a good thing for the people of China. Because after that, they're going to put a little bit of reform in. This happens, and let me just a little side note here, this happens in Soviet countries everywhere. Lenin dies, and they do a few reforms. Mao dies, they do a few reforms. What are the reforms geared toward to? A little bit of capitalism. That is the only reason that small influence of capitalism into China is the only reason China is still a major player in the world. If it were not for that, if they were strictly communist, strictly everything is done by the Communist Book and Communist Manifesto, they would fail. Soviet Union, they failed. And they became Russia, and they've got that influence of capitalism now to a certain extent. There's still a lot of communists in Russia, don't get me wrong, but the capitalist influence is the only reason that they still exist. But even China, under their reforms, they still did not want you talking bad about the government. They don't to this day. I mean, you know what's going on in the world with this COVID-19 and how a lot of it was hidden. I mean, we know. We're not dumb. And one of the things that happened when I was younger was Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square happened in 1989. They had student protests that were wanting reform in the government. And they went to this beautiful place called Tiananmen Square in China, and they protested. They went out in the streets. And the Chinese government let it go on a few days, and then they brought in tanks, and they shot up about 2,000 people. Your book says about 2,000 people. And I will include a video that I want you to watch on Tiananmen Square. I think it's important that we see these type of things. But they just mowed down this rebellion. And if you don't think they would today, you're sadly mistaken. They would do the same thing. You do not criticize the Prime Minister Xi or Premier Xi, whatever they call him. You don't criticize them. You'll end up dead. Wake up dead. So China, communist country, still called the Chi-Coms or Red China. They're still a communist nation. Keep that in mind. Your book mentions the Berlin blockade after, and we've talked about this, after World War II. Of course, Berlin located in East Germany, but 3/4 of it belonged to the Allies, and the other part belonged to the Soviet Union. And the problem was people were fleeing East Berlin. Why? Because it was under Soviet control and everything on the other side looked better. And I don't remember if it was this class or another, but you know, if I'm sitting here and I'm starving and I'm cold, don't have any electricity, I'm sick, and I look across the street and my neighbor, and if I mentioned this before, I apologize, but I look across the street, my neighbor's grilling out and they're having a good time and things are going well, I'm going to walk across the street and go live over there. Okay? And that's what was happening in Berlin. You have West Berlin that is booming, that's doing well. People they've got food, they've got medicine, they've got clothes, they've got housing, they've got electric, they've got all these good things. And in East Berlin, people are standing there at gunpoint, keeping them in, and they end up building a wall, the Berlin Wall. America and the Allies, European forces, have been bringing in food and supplies to East Berlin. And as a result, this blockade, they couldn't get the supplies. So America had to resort to an airdrop. And we flew these big cargo planes. We didn't have any weapons on them. We didn't want to start a war with Russia. But we would fly these cargo planes over and we would drop food. And I believe that your book mentions every 90 seconds a plane would drop food 24 hours a day and supplies in East Berlin. Kennedy, when he was told about the wall going up in the 60s, you had the blockade at first and then you got the wall going up. And Kennedy said, hey, you know, they said, what are we going to do about it, President Kennedy? He said, nothing. He said, there's no greater picture to the world to show how bad communism is than to show that you have to build a wall to keep your people in. True. How true. Okay. Moving along, Korean War. I want you to read about that. Again, you had a North Korea and a South Korea, and the North Korea government was communist. They invaded South Korea. They almost took the island over, and MacArthur steps in, and it mentions the Battle of Incheon, but and you'll see that on your map, but MacArthur pushed them back. Douglas MacArthur was a great general. He pushed them back and could have gone into North Korea, and the president at the time did not want to do that. So the bad thing is that the Chinese jumped in. They got froggy and jumped, and they sent about 100,000 soldiers over to North Korea. And so it ended up being a deadlock. They signed an agreement, and to this day you hear about the 38th parallel. That's where President Trump went a couple of years ago to meet Kim Jong-un, who may or may not be on the borderline of death right now, but met him at the 38th parallel and crossed over into North Korea. But North Korea, still communist to this day, and South Korea a free nation. And they say at night you can fly over the peninsula of Korea, and if you fly over South Korea, you'll see all these lights and all this hustle and bustle. And if you fly over North Korea, it's basically dark. Difference between communism and capitalism. Vietnam, your book mentions it. I'm going to jump ahead real quick. Vietnam War. Ho Chi Minh resisted the French. They wanted their island back after World War II, their claims in Indochina, and Ho Chi Minh resisted them. He beat the French, and the communists helped out, but the Soviets helped out a little bit. But the Vietnamese communists won at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and they destroyed the French army. They had a peace conference at that point, and they said, let's divide the island up north and south, just like Korea, and with North Vietnam, South Vietnam, north being communist, south being free. The problem was the Viet Cong, because if you divide a nation and just draw a line like that, then you're going to have some that are sympathizers. The Viet Cong were in South Vietnam, but they wanted to be communist. And so the whole fighting of that war, if you read about Vietnam and you study on Vietnam, that was the problem. You had Viet Cong in South Vietnam that were helping the enemy, and you never knew who you were fighting. It was kind of like fighting terrorism. You don't know who your enemy is. And so you might go into a village and people that look like civilians that should be on your side start shooting at you. It was that type of thing. We increased under President Johnson, sent a bunch of troops in. Finally, and we could spend hours on this, but there was a kind of a perspective in the United States in the halls of government and in the people. As you watch television, you see these reports of these soldiers coming back in caskets, flag draped caskets every night. You say, well, why are we over there? Why are we over there? Let's get our boys home. And that sentiment starts to take place. And Congress would not, and the president would not let the generals run the war. They were trying to run the war. Well, hey, you're not a military genius. These generals are. So it was a mess. We ended up, Nixon pulls us out of Vietnam. And guess what? Within just a short period of time, all of Vietnam falls. We had lost more than 50,000 soldiers, cost us about $146 billion in cost in Vietnam, and it was a terrible disaster. And I'll tell you the thing that was so awful about Vietnam as well. A lot of the soldiers, because you would go into these villages and sometimes you might have to shoot a kid because they come at you with a weapon. They're part of the Viet Cong. A lot of them were called baby killers and murderers and all of these things because a lot of that stuff was being broadcast on the news, which I don't think it ever should have been. But they come back and people are spitting on soldiers as they come back from war at the airports. They're calling them names. They're holding up signs. Awful treatment. And listen, I've known people that have fought in Vietnam, and the way they were treated coming back was just awful. They should have been hailed as heroes. They should have been told, hey, great job, we're proud of you. But instead, they're mocked and made fun of and spit on. So, awful stuff. Also, real quick, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We came to the borderline of nuclear war in 1962. Basically, the Soviets were trying to put some and set up some nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And you know, if you have a missile, all it's got to do is lob over into the United States, and boom. Had a big confrontation, the Cuban Missile Crisis. They also shot down one of our spy planes, which caused some tension. Kennedy did not want to just go in fighting. He set up a blockade and would block any Soviet ships if they came and would force them to turn around. And finally one gets up there and they turn around. So we knew that maybe we could negotiate this thing out. There were a lot of secret negotiations, a lot of good books on that, a lot of good movies on that. But long story short, we came close to nuclear war, but we didn't. We ended up pulling some missiles out of Europe as well. I believe it was Turkey. Turkey. As kind of an exchange. They said, well, you know, we can't have our missiles here, but y'all can have them in Turkey right next to us. So we kind of gave concessions there, and it ended. But the United States came very close to having a nuclear war. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, and I'm just going to mention a couple of things on this. You can read about it. Technological supremacy. There was a rivalry for it. And throughout the Cold War, it was a buildup of weapons. Okay, who's got the better tanks? Who's got the better bombs? You know, the Soviet Union finally was in 1949. They developed the atomic bomb, and so America's like, oh, well, let's develop the hydrogen bomb. And then the Soviets get a hydrogen bomb, and it just continued. And then, hey, you've got 50, we need 100, and on, back and forth. Tanks, military, guns. Not only that, but there was also the space race. We had Sputnik. They had Sputnik. They launched Sputnik in 57? Satellite, little ball with some legs on it, little steel thing. And Americans feared, hey, all they've got to do is put a nuclear bomb in that, fly right over our house, and boom. And if they can launch them into space like that, we're dead. I mean, a lot of people thought that it was a scary premise. And so America started the space race. We said, well, we've got to get a satellite up. And that's when the space race began. And the Soviets were always a step ahead of us until it got to landing on the moon. But because of the Cold War, we developed a lot of technology to defeat them in this. If they're going to have people in space, if they're going to have machines and satellites and rockets in space, we're going to have them too, and we're going to have them better. So there was a big build-up on that. It all bases, as your book calls it, MAD, mutually assured destruction. That means that we have enough that y'all understand that if y'all bomb us, we're going to lob everything at you, and you're destroyed, and we know that you're going to lob everything at us, and we're both destroyed. So when you think about it in the terms of, okay, we're going to wipe out everybody several times over, what's the point? What's the point? And so that's kind of the game plan. I will say this, and we're going to transition into the Middle East and collapse of the Soviet Union. I will just say this about the collapse of the Soviet Union is the reason the Soviet Union collapsed is because of Ronald Reagan and Star Wars and military spending. This whole idea of racing to build more and build more and build more, it catches up with them, and they say, well, either we build more weapons and we all starve, or we don't build any more and we eat. And it comes down to that. And they decide, hey, is it worth it? Let's end this thing. So that's kind of what happens, and we'll get into that tomorrow. Listen, no assignment today. Hopefully you've watched this entire video. Have a great weekend. We will finish this chapter, it appears, maybe on Tuesday, have a test on Wednesday, and probably do a Skype next Thursday. But we'll see. We'll play it by ear. Have a great weekend.